Well, that's Victoria down to New South Wales. Wherever you are in Australia, you would have read plenty of rubbish about the goings-on with the government of New South Wales, the National Party led by John Barilaro and the government led by Gladys Berejiklian. And, of course, the argument given currency was that Barilaro was involved in some petty episode about koalas and was threatening to blow up the coalition government in New South Wales. Now, I know in most things these days few people do any homework, but koalas are the thin edge of the wedge. Scott Morrison will be in all sorts of trouble retaining government if he can't improve the National Party vote. And under the leadership of this bloke McCormack, there is no reason for people to vote National. They'll tell you that in drought and bushfires, McCormack has nothing to offer. Barilaro is to be congratulated for his patience. Under the Liberal government, headed by Michael Baird and then Gladys Berejiklian, the lefty Liberals knew best and they forced council amalgamations on the bush. The bush wasn't consulted, they hated it. The same Liberal leadership, backed by a couple of stupid National Party MPs, thought they could wipe out the greyhound industry. Well, there was a by-election in Orange at the time of all that, and the coalition, the National Party candidate, suffered a swing of 34%. The bush made a lethal electoral response. Forced council amalgamations in the greyhound industry. Then there's the Murray Darling. How'd you like to be a farmer? You pay for your water entitlement. It's taken from you for environmental flows, and there's no compensation. The Shooters and Fishers Party saw the abandonment and changed their name to Shooters, Fishers and Farmers. What happened at last year's state election? The seat of Murray, a 27.8 swing to Shooters, Fishers and Farmers. The National Party lost it. Barwon, 21.5%. They lost the seat. This on top of Orange, which, as I said, a 34% swing. Only Barilaro got the message. The lefties in the Liberal Party went on their merry way. Don't burn the fuel on the forest floor. Well, you can't have a fire without fuel. We know the rest. Koala habitats destroyed. So now they want to make the farmers pay the bill. The Macquarie Street Liberals and Berejiklian at the helm say, we're now going to build some new habitats. And the number of trees and areas that qualify as a koala home will increase from 10 to 123, 12-fold. Yep, make the farmer pay. Is there anything more iconic than the Tamworth Music Festival? But because of stupid blanket coronavirus restrictions, it's had to announce the bush icon. It won't be on in January, do you mind? Because under the Berejiklian alarmist lockdowns, they wouldn't be able to go ahead. So we heard in the so-called stoush, Gladys Berejiklian was ready to march to Government House and sack a stack of Nationals for doing no more than trying to represent their constituency. Gladys Berejiklian should modestly admit that without the 13 National Party seats, she would not be Premier. She'd be on Jodie Mackay's side of the Parliament or on a pension. The paradox of all of this is that people like Barilaro and fellow National Party ministers like Bronwyn Taylor, Adam Marshall, Melinda Pavey and Sarah Mitchell, they're the ones fighting to preserve the government. Because if the lefties take charge in Macquarie Street, which they have, the Shooters, Fishers and Mark Latham's One Nation will swallow the National Party. It'll be goodbye Gladys. The koala issue was a metaphor of a bigger problem. And as Mark Latham, the One Nation leader, has pointed out brilliantly, you'll see this in a moment, this is not a bush issue. Stokes, the planning minister, and his colleagues, obviously cheered on by Berejiklian, have created these maps of koala habitats. Well, I'll tell you something. I'll bet you wherever you're viewing this, you're on the map. Campbelltown? Yep, you're there. Green Valley? You're there. The centre of Newcastle? The Town Hall? Yeah, you're there. The only person I read at the weekend with any perspective on this was Yoni Bashan, the New South Wales political correspondent for the Australian newspaper, who wrote with clarity, and I quote, a true victory for the Premier would have been to de-escalate this crisis weeks ago. That we had to watch this train wreck in slow motion is an indictment of her leadership. Well, it's Mark Latham Day Monday. He's with me from home, by the way, on a de Giro. I don't know what de Giro is, but it means we get a picture of him as if he was in the studio. Mark, thank you for your time. Do you think that on that march up to Government House, pretending to be tough, Berejiklian might have discovered she wouldn't be in government if it weren't for the National Party?
Well, that's 100% true, of course, but your broader editorial there, Alan, has pointed out policy, cultural failure after failure. Gladys Berejiklian and the Liberals have presided over policy disasters in the greyhound decision, the council amalgamations, the abortion bill last year. I saw this up close recently on uranium mining, where Gladys had more positions than the Kama Sutra. You know, if you don't know what you believe in politics, you're not nurturing your party, you're not providing leadership, you're not providing policy direction, and the whole show can fall apart. And that essentially is what happened. It's not the fault of John Barilaro, it's a failure from the Premier to nurture her government with policy leadership. And what's happened on the Koala SEP is just completely unbelievable, that places like Liverpool and the centre of Newcastle wouldn't have seen a koala for more than 60 years are included in these maps.
Mark, I'll interrupt you.
Planning Minister Stokes today...
Mark, I'll just interrupt you there because Mark knows this scene backwards. I just want to take these maps one by one, and let's take the first map here. We've got 3 maps. Now, Stokes and Keane and Berejiklian and so on were the architects. Now, Mark will explain, this is Green Valley in Liverpool. Mark, you grew up there. Explain the pink.
Well, the pink are areas that are supposed to be koala habitat, but you're right, I grew up in Green Valley, and in the 1960s they shaved all the trees and all the topsoil off the top, and you didn't have any trees growing back to the 70s and 80s after they built the public housing estate. And you could survey every single person in Green Valley, a built-out residential area in Western Sydney, and they'd be shocked to hear that the clump of trees in their backyard is designated as koala habitat. It's not just the farmers suffering this. If you wanted to put in a granny flat, a house extension, a development application, knock down a couple of trees, some bloke marches out with a clipboard to check out whether you've got koalas in a backyard that wouldn't have seen koalas for at least 60 years.
Well, then here we go.
And extra cost, extra restrictions. You know, this is a land use planning disaster.
Absolutely. Now, let's go to Campbelltown, which you represented in the federal parliament. This is the second map. Campbelltown. Mark.
Well, the residential area of Campbelltown, particularly west of the railway line, they haven't got koalas either. There is a koala corridor from Kent Lynn down to Wedderburn and Gilead. Why not protect that? You know, why colour all of Campbelltown pink when there is one area where they've done nothing about it, Keane and Stokes, they could protect that area now. But the residential areas that were developed, suburbs that were built in the 1970s and 80s, again, people would be shocked to think a clump of trees in their backyard is designated as koala habitat. You know, this is as bizarre and pathetic and absurd a policy outcome. And apparently for 6 months, Alan, the National Party have been trying to get these maps corrected.
That's it.
And Gladys has presided over this, allowed her Green Liberal ministers to run, and they've done nothing to correct this absolute disaster.
Let's go quickly to the centre of Newcastle, Mark. This is the third map. The town hall is on the top of the shot. Look at this. This is Newcastle. I mean, there's not a koala within 150 miles.
Well, that's right. I mean, no, well, that's right. On the foreshore there, apparently you get the drop bears in Newcastle, which had been used to everyone in that town, the commercial centre, the town hall, the residential area, Cooks Hill, they're all supposed to have koala habitat. I mean, it makes a mockery of the policy, doesn't it?
It does.
But you're imposing development restrictions and extra costs on people who would find this laughable. The ministers are laughable. This Rob Stokes is supposed to have a planning degree from Oxford. He ought to hand it back in, because this is an absolute planning shambles.
Absolutely.
And that Gladys did nothing about it for 6 months is shameful. I don't know how Barilaro put up with it. I would have been ripping the furniture apart in frustration that this was allowed to happen.
Just hang on there for a minute. I want to bring in the former Senator John Williams, magnificent fighter for the bush. They called him Whacker. A good man, this fellow. Now, John, good evening to you. But as you say, all Australians love koalas. We want them to thrive. You've got koalas metres from your house. They're not under threat because your farm accommodates sheep and cattle, and the amount of fuel on the ground is reduced by grazing, and the chance of a catastrophic fire is low, and so it can be a safe habitat. But you mentioned that you've got 7 million hectares. We've got 7 million hectares of national parks, and the Berejiklian government has done nothing about burning the fuel on the floor, so the koala habitats will burn out in the bushfire.
Yeah, good evening, Alan, and you're exactly right. 7 million hectares of national park in New South Wales. It has become a firebomb, Alan. The example I gave in my column in the Australian newspaper today was the Pilliga Scrub, where it used to be a forest under forest and forest and managed and grazed. Now it's a national park, burned from one end to the other, killing the koalas. And they're saying, oh, I've had a disastrous reduction in the number of koalas in the Pilliga forest. Well, that's because it's not managed. I mean, you've got to manage this country. This locking up and leave it is simply a political ploy to say to the people in the cities, we're great environmentalists, we'll create more national parks and everyone will love us. In the meantime, it burns. They burn eventually and kill the flora and fauna in those very national parks that should be protected.
Absolutely. And, of course, the coalition have been overtaken by lefties. That's the problem. And while that's the problem, how are you going to reform any of this? Barilaro is fighting to save the government. Mark's here with us. They're going to vote for Mark Latham and shooters and fishers and farmers. I mean, our first Australians knew what to do, didn't they?
They certainly did, Alan. And I think the situation, look, I'm fed up with SEP 46 and now SEP 44 and people in the city running regional Australia. I think what we desperately need is a Minister for Environment, for the urban environment, a Liberal, and we need a Nationals Minister for Regional Environment, so the National Party controls the regional environment, and these lefty do-gooders in the city do not control our environment and do so much damage. And, of course, as soon as we have a fire, there's not the level of fuel on the ground. The left just say it's climate change. This is all caused from climate change. That is rubbish, Alan. It's caused through mismanagement of our national parks.
Mismanagement.
And it's been happening for 25 years through all sides of politics.
Good on you. Wacker, great to talk to you. Glad you're enjoying your retirement. Let's go back to Mark for the final say here. Mark, where is this going to finish up? I mean, is the government of New South Wales dysfunctional?
Well, it has become that way, Alan, and Wacker is right there. 12% of the New South Wales landmass is national park, 850 national parks and reserves. Many of them don't get a single visitor all year, but in terms of locking up gum trees, that's the best you can do for the koalas. And Rob Stokes today, I think it's a very important quote. Rob Stokes today, there was a letter released in the Channel 9 newspapers, and Rob Stokes in this letter said, live koalas are notoriously difficult to detect, even via expert survey. So I mean, he doesn't know where the koalas are.
No.
And you can't regulate what you can't see.
No.
You can't regulate if you don't know where the koalas are. So they've got a policy that's really a tree protection policy, that if it could be a koala tree, and if they're guessing that maybe it could be sometime in the next 20 years, they're putting development restrictions on people. This is as wacky,
Absolutely.
a public policy outcome as you'll ever see.